Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. We love recording this show and are very appreciative of all the positive feedback we've been getting and the thousands of listeners who are tuning in every week. The show does take a lot of time and effort and investment from us. We would love to keep this going, and we need your help to do it. Please support the show by joining our community at Patreon. Our Patreon community get ongoing access to new and exclusive episodes, even after the completion of this initial season. You can find the link in our podcast bio in the description of each episode, or you can go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. On this week's episode, we're diving into the topic of spiritual awakenings and how that process is different for each of us. So what's your take on a spiritual awakening?
I think they're very different to what's out in mainstream. But I do think, and again, I'm intrigued to hear your perspective on it, because I also think spiritual awakenings are overrated as well to what they actually offer a person.
Well, the whole concept that I had of a spiritual awakening and the reality of what I would say my spiritual awakenings have been completely different.
I do think there's so much pressure around having a spiritual awakening, or it's as if something we actually have control over having or not having control over having. There's just so much pressure surrounded by it, and there's a lot of comparing yourself to another person's spiritual awakening and then trying to follow their exact steps in hopes that you can have one too. So there's actually huge parts to it where I don't think it doesn't always create a healthy environment for growth if you're trying to search for a spiritual awakening itself. Because I know for my particular one, I definitely wasn't searching for it when it happened. Whereas for a decade prior, you could say I was searching for it and it never came, so to speak. And I think that does come back to what is spiritual awakening, because I do think that is there's such a vast definition and meaning to what a spiritual awakening is to a person.
My experience and what I would say my take on a spiritual awakening is an event or a moment in time that I can't turn away from, that creates so much dissidence to my normal life that I in some way felt shattered and didn't understand why it was happening when it's been happening to me. Yet it's kind of changed my path or my train of thought to something. So I guess I need to give you the first couple examples of what I'm thinking about. Let's say the very first time I would say I would have what I would call a spiritual awakening is when I was a teenager. I had gotten myself into some trouble. I didn't know how to get myself out of the trouble. I decided I'd rather die than tell my father. Seemed logical at the time. And I went into my bedroom to actually, act on that. And I had something happen to me. Now, the way I describe it to many people, and this is what in my past I would have said was a spiritual awakening, but consequently after that, they weren't like that. So I think there's so many different types of awakenings that people have. But for me, I sat on the bed, I had this plan, and it's like the whole room went white. And I couldn't tell you exactly what happened. It's like the window opened up and there was all this light. And I don't know how long that happened for. And then I had this sense of, oh, I know what to do now. And it wasn't take my own life. I was 14. So I would have called that a spiritual awakening because it I stopped thinking that I was so alone, that I was not going to be on this journey on my own. And that gave me a lot of hope. The second time I had what somebody might call a spiritual awakening was not anywhere nearly as pleasant. Again, I might have been a little fed up with life. I might have decided I'm out of here and tried to take my life again. And I didn't succeed. And I spent 3 days after I had been revived. I spent 3 days in so much pain, and so just how I remember it is there was so much emotion, so much pain. So I felt so lost. I would have loved for the white light experience again, but I didn't have the white light experience again. I just had an incredible amount of emotion. And when all of the emotion ended, it was like, right, okay, that's no longer an option. But I knew when I got to that point, I knew it was no longer an option ever again. So how did I know that? I don't know. Did I have angels? Did I have stars? No, I had pain. And what ensued after that was when I got sober. And the first 2 months of that time period, I watched my entire world fall apart. And I can remember quoting and saying to people who were helping me, yeah, get clean, get sober, they said. Your life will get better, they said. And all I keep seeing is my life falling apart. I was better off when I was using than I am now when I'm trying to get clean. So, I don't think it's an event. I think it's an unfolding that it felt like a force of nature that I couldn't contain, which doesn't look anything like what people are talking about out there about spiritual awakenings.
No, I think a lot of people in mainstream often portray it as a very peaceful experience and event, which I've no doubt it can be for many, but as you're saying, that there can be many different spiritual awakenings, and I feel people actually have them without even realize that they've had a spiritual awakening of some kind. Again, it comes back to definitions. But I do feel in my experience, spiritual awakenings have been more about pressing a reset button in an area of your life, somewhat dissolving of who you've been taught to be in that area of your life, and then coming into a place of rediscovering who you are in the present moment in that part of your life. So I do think you can have a spiritual awakening in your mind, in your emotions, in your body, or you can have a very unusual or amazing energy experience. But I do feel that people don't realize that you can have a spiritual awakening in the mind, in the emotions, but people are able to recognize it more in the body and definitely in an energy sense.
What I really love about what you just said is the part about it being a reset of sorts from who you thought you were to this new reset of who you are in the present moment. Because that definitely fits, because I've had a few of these happen now, and that fits every single time that you've talked about. I was on a seminar once and had what is defined out in mainstream as a Kundalini experience. Boy, did I ever get excited. I did, because that's what I was taught a spiritual awakening was. And yes, it was a very pleasant experience. Would I put that in the reset box? No.
The traditional spiritual experience that people want, as amazing as they can be, once you experience it once, I do feel it can create a new addiction for people to always want to go back there and to want to stay in that place, which in some ways is misunderstanding, I feel at times, of actually what a spiritual awakening or spiritual experience is actually there to give you. You're not there to maintain it or hold on to it. To me, it's an opportunity to actually move on to the next chapter of your life in some ways. And that does mean shedding many different other areas of your life. And that's why it does often feel like my life is falling apart or things are not the same anymore, because they're not. And I feel once you feel something change on an energy level from within. Is a party that just understands you can no longer maintain what once was. And there starts the journey of actually that transition, which takes quite a period of time to get your head around because of the different layers of what makes us a human being.
Mm-hmm. And there, for me, I know there was a sense of, I can't go back.
Yeah.
So I used to say, it's like I started waking up, not waking up like, oh, I'm more awake than anybody else. But all of a sudden I'm looking at my life and how I think and feel and respond differently. And I can't go back to being unaware of who I am, my experiences, and how those experiences have changed me. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
So here's a question that I have about that then. What is the purpose of having those moments, of those resets?
I often think the resets are a long time coming. We just pretend not to see them coming for so long, or we just wished they weren't in our awareness. And I do feel, especially if we're relating it back to previous conversations of certain experiences being laid out for us and certain things having to unfold at a certain time in our lives, it gets to a point for all of us where ignoring simply isn't an option anymore because there's things that need to be a part of our experience. Therefore, I do feel there can be a series of different events from externally or a series of events that internally that bring on these resets is actually to help us grow and to actually look at what we've found difficult to admit or to look at ourselves.
It does, because my perception of a spiritual awakening prior to, in the early days, I want to say, is I thought the more I spiritually awaken, the more knowledge I'm going to have. And so therefore, the more serene my life is going to be because I'm awake and I'm aware and everything's wonderful. And that isn't how it played out in my life. And so the first few times that this happens, and yes, I am saying the first few times, it was very disorienting for me because I thought, well, this is not what they tell you in the books. And this is not what I don't feel like I've graduated to the next class. Do you know what I mean?
Quite the opposite
at
times. Because, again, a similar experience in the sense of when Michael came into my life. And when I say Michael came into my life, he was never not part of my life, but I think that deeper awareness that he was part of my life is what is part of the spiritual awakening. I remember through my teenage years chasing the spiritual awakening of hopefully getting to a place of peace and unity and getting all the answers and knowing where to go. And then what ended up in my spiritual experience or my spiritual awakening, I ended up started channeling an angel. And I remember thinking, this isn't going to make my life any easier trying to explain this to people. It's quite the opposite of simplifying the process. It suddenly felt like this is going to take much more work to actually begin to explain to people. It was, I guess, part of what's associated with spirituality, with the woo-woo that I didn't think I was signing up for, because I was always quite a logical person. So when it came to the reset of the mind or reset of the emotions or reset of the body, all of that seemed quite practical. But channeling an angel was definitely something, channeling Michael, to me wasn't part of the process that really hit reset, I guess, of even my expectations of what spirituality was to me, but also what a spiritual awakening was. As you said, it comes in so many shapes and forms for each person, but I definitely wasn't expecting.
And it certainly wasn't one day you woke up and you were talking to Michael.
No, it was problematic before I started talking to Michael, and it got even more problematic after talking to Michael, because there was so many areas where, as Gareth, you had to look at everything differently and press reset, because there was lots of realization that Michael wasn't going anywhere. So there were 4 parts of Gareth, mentally, emotionally, physically, had to evolve in a new way that just didn't have to happen before, or didn't need to be looked at. And I know,
Gareth, you said before that you were raised in a family where you knew many channelers, and you knew, this wasn't out of the ordinary for you. But when that part of the awakening happened, how shock-filled or how problematic or how distressing to you that didn't think was going to have that path, how distressing was it for you? And maybe distressing is the wrong word, but how, like, whoa, what's happening here? This isn't what I expected.
Yeah, because as I said before, I didn't expect it at all for the age that I was. But I also knew that even though it would make my life a lot simpler in receiving a lot more understandings, it probably also knew I'd be going through a lot more life events. So it would be more challenging in certain ways in order to get the guidance, in order to assist other people. Because even though I grew up in a home that knew a lot of channels, I also was able to see firsthand how a lot of those channels battled with the fact that they were a channel at the same time, which was maybe over that decade. And even the channels that I was referencing, you could say some of them are even now suppressed channels. They're channels, but they don't do it publicly. No one knows. Maybe their family knew, but it just got too much for them when they went back to normal lives, day-to-day lives. And that part of them never actually came to light publicly. Whereas I knew from my particular experience that suppressing it wasn't necessarily an option for me.
It's interesting. And so would you have called that time when you became aware of Michael, would you call that a spiritual awakening?
Definitely, because if we're going back to what we talked about earlier because that particular spiritual experience did hit reset within me in mind, body, emotions, everything, and just in a different ways.
And so when, I think we're kind of covering this when we're talking about it. And what keeps coming to my mind at the moment is Curtis. So Curtis, for those who don't know, is my brother. And I had a close relationship with him. And he was getting ready to leave the planet. And he wanted me to come and help with him to transition because he felt like, I would understand the process more than the way that we were raised and the people that were surrounding him. And I agreed to it. And so at one point I went home. It wasn't that time. We sat down, we had a chat, and he said, Kim, when I get to the other side, what do you want? I was so excited. I was like, oh, Kurt, I don't care if it takes, 100 years. You have to find a way to get back here and give me the answers. He said, be careful what you're asking for. And I said, Kurt, I don't care. I just want the answers. So as the story goes, and everybody knows, my brother did pass away, and I wasn't there when he passed away. I did talk to him on the phone the morning of, and he told me, I think today's the day. I'm tired. I'm ready. And he had been sick for a long time. And I started to go through the grief, and I think it was the third night after he passed away, I found myself in my bathroom on the floor in a fetal position, being flooded with images and memories. And it was so overwhelming and so similar to that time right before I got sober. And I remember thinking, no, thank you. Stop. And of course, that didn't get to happen. And it was, again, according to the definition that you just spoke about, it was a huge reset. I didn't act on it straight away because it was way too much information for me. And I didn't have the tools, the skills, or the support to act on. And it wasn't like he gave me profound world answers. It was all about what was happening for me in my life. It wasn't about anybody or anything else. So that was another one of those moments that I would say it was like a reset. It was big. Would I call that a spiritual awakening? I don't know. But it felt very connected.
Because I think at this point, from our own experiences and from many people we've talked to, a spiritual awakening is often something you don't want to receive. Or it's an understanding that you didn't want, but it's actually what you needed the most. And there's often not quite a lot of resistance to actually come to terms with that reality that you know it to be true when you're experiencing it. You can't deny its truth, but it doesn't make processing it on a human level any easier to actually coming to terms with it. And it can often be a very solo journey after any of these experiences, because it's very hard to relay back or to explain to any other person.
True. I would agree with that 100%. And I think, I'm aware of what we're saying, and I'm going, oh gosh, I don't really want to paint it all as problematic because it's not. Because each one of these events that have happened, I'm sure through your life and my life, have really helped me become more aware of me and opened up the journey, for lack of a better way of saying it. It just sometimes can sound really intimidating.
And all spiritual awakenings are beautiful, but I feel often what makes the problematic ones, the different ones, difficult, and there's going to be a pattern in this, I guess, with our conversations. If we don't have a good relationship with our emotions and our mind, then a lot of the spiritual awakenings that we have are either going to be quite challenging, because it's bringing up all the parts of us often that we don't have a good relationship with. Whereas over time, the different spiritual experiences I've had have only become more joyous or more peaceful as I've developed a better relationship with my mind and emotions and body. Whereas beforehand, over a decade ago, it was a very different thing, because I was often fighting the spiritual awakenings because I was defining them or controlling them to what they should be versus what they are or were.
I would agree with that. And I think for me and for maybe a lot of people, when that does happen and that reset hits, you're like, that's not what I expected. It's not what I expected. It's not what I wanted. And not only is it not what I wanted, but now where to from here? And I don't necessarily have anybody that can guide me on that.
But especially when you have that spiritual experience and it does bring up a lot within you, if you do go for assistance or help, or to someone to help walk you through it or to what is next, often you hear the same sort of patterns over and over again, in the sense of, why don't you go meditate on it? Or why don't you go tune in with it? And it's often, people mean well, but at the same time, it's often not practical enough to actually to walk you through what just happened. If you walk into a room and say, I've just had a spiritual awakening, people would normally be so excited for you, but really the one that we just had often wasn't that exciting. It was kind of scary in the sense of how you just realize how everything is about to change or just changed moments ago.
I definitely agree with that.
I think even in understanding what a spiritual awakening is and the support that's actually needed around that particular event, because as we said, it changes for every single person. But often when they have it, all they know to do is actually to try to conceal it, because they don't know how to work with it. But therefore that only causes it to become more problematic as you actually move forward, because you're trying to conceal something that you knew that when you experienced it, it was great truth. But just because we don't know how to talk about it, then it obviously scares us so much more and becomes part of a bigger problem.
And often some of the awarenesses that come about, you look around your life and you're like, okay, I know that I can't keep living like this. And what is that going to mean? Because I've set my whole life up to live this path. And all of a sudden I've been hit a right turn. It's like, how do I navigate that?
As you said earlier, we don't want to paint a picture that spiritual awakenings are horrible or distressing all the time, because they're not. I do think we're here to experience both the positive and negative of spiritual awakenings in our own right in different ways. But in saying that, we're not here to live in the positive ones 24/7. We're not here to live in the negative ones 24/7. But we do need to question and understand why both need to exist, and often how the positive experiences that come with spiritual awakening gives us a lot of hope and faith of it's actually why we're here, and there is a greater meaning or purpose to it, and maybe that lift that we needed. But at the same time, the negative experiences also shows us of how little we still understand about our own individual journey while we're here right now, that does need to be explored, and that's why it scares us. So you can see how both are correct in their own way, but we've been taught to mainstream to prioritize, of course, the positive one, and that when we've had a negative one, we don't talk about it, or we just continue to chase.
Well, quite often I would say when we have a negative one, it's referred to as I've had a nervous breakdown instead of, I've had a spiritual awakening. And the positive ones, while they are fantastic, and I've had several of those as well, and they do give me hope. They did give me hope at those times for myself, which is I can only speak. I did think that when I started to have them, did that mean that the suffering would end? And that was the shock for me when the suffering didn't end. It was different.
Would you say it just shone a new light on what suffering is, or a new development in understanding the suffering you're experiencing at that time?
It took a while for me to get to that part because, you have to understand my background. And, I was raised in a Catholic background. So I spent quite a bit of time, probably right up until when my brother Kurt died, thinking, well, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? Why am I continuing being punished? I'm being punished. I'm being punished. Instead of understanding that I'm not actually being punished, I'm getting that reset and I'm having a chance to then look at this differently than continuing to stay in the victim mode, which, okay, that in itself was a huge right turn. And so, of course, that was going to take a while. I'd spent a whole portion of my life living one way. And now all of a sudden, I'm turning it around to live a different way, which was like learning Greek, being brought up in America. And so I wouldn't call it the suffering continued. It was just, whole new territory. I've got to learn how to walk differently. That's what I would say. And I've been asked the question many times. Do you think some of the spiritual awakenings that you've had, would you consider that they ruined your life? Now, if you had asked me that question 25 years ago, I'd have jumped on that bandwagon and said yes. Today, I would say no. And so let's talk about that for a minute and that concept that does it really ruin your life, or does it just...
It ruins the version of your life you were trying to protect or not look at. But it also gives you life. But even to give life, you have to go through labor. And that's often a very painful experience.
And I love that that's how you just put that. Because it is true, isn't it? Yeah, it's like labor pains.
There's a part of you that knows it's worthwhile, even if it doesn't feel that way in that moment in time, or maybe you can't put it into words often. It is a part of growing, of what it comes back down to. And it is such a natural process, but we're going to constantly resist what we don't understand or what we've been taught not to prioritize. So often when there's a massive growth spurt happening within us, suddenly your awareness changes, and that it also changes how you operate in day to day throughout this world. And it's that part of it that can honestly be quite challenging. You have to start from scratch once again. It can be tricky for any of us to get our heads around because we spent so much time building towards something, and then for life to throw in an experience that we weren't expecting that makes us hit reset. We don't often take too kindly to those experiences.
That I certainly agree with. And so that's where I think people have the different perceptions of what a spiritual awakening is, and whether they're defining it as awakening or as a nervous breakdown or collapse of some kind. And for me, I would not have termed any of the experiences that I experienced, especially through my 20s and 30s, as spiritual awakenings. It has only been in hindsight that as I've looked back and I've gone, okay, that makes sense. That was one of those pivotal moments in my life where I did make that turn. And as hard as it felt at the time, now I'm extremely grateful for that amount of growth. But the question I want to ask you, and I don't know if it's true for you, but for me, it has felt, and I've often shared this, like for whatever reason, when these events started to happen for me, I felt like I left the highway and went on the road less traveled. And it felt like a very lonely process at times, because the relationships that I used to have, I couldn't speak to them about some of the things that I was experiencing because I didn't feel that they had the ability to get what I was saying, or a lot of times I just got told I was airy-fairy and crazy.
I do think getting to know yourself is often a lonely journey, but it doesn't mean that you feel alone all the time throughout it. It can be a very peaceful one, because even before that particular spiritual awakening I had from meeting Michael at that stage, you could say myself and my family were already on the road less travelled, in the sense of we were all deeply in spirituality, which wasn't normal traditionally. I'd already thought I was doing the spiritual journey quite well at that point. And now looking back, I really wasn't. I thought I was doing it. And of course I was doing it for me at that time, which was correct for me. But then when Michael came on, it went from taking the scenic route to suddenly it felt like walking through a jungle at nighttime on my own with no one else in sight and just weird noises around me.
Yes.
So very different than being on a highway,
on a side road,
on a scenic route, driving along with its beautiful views. It's amazing, as you said, in hindsight, how you can see the evolution of it. But the point of a lot of these spiritual awakening or experiences is to stimulate growth within you in ways you didn't think was possible, or to put you in spaces or positions where you didn't think you'd be strong enough to make it through it or survive. So it does completely hit reset, not only to the relationship that you have with yourself, but then also you begin to question more the relationships with the people around you at that particular time, of how you're conditioning people or how people are conditioning you to be a certain way. And I think often a spiritual awakening gives you the opportunity to question a lot of those areas in ways you maybe wouldn't have deeply before.
So what I want to ask you, I want to ask what your opinion is of this, because I've often thought in these terms, and I could be wrong. So that's why I thought, let's talk this out. When someone comes to me and they're talking to me about an illness, I sometimes see illnesses as a form of spiritual awakening. Would you agree with that?
I would.
So how is it then that no one else seems to talk about that?
I think because when it comes to illnesses, and depending on the illness, it's such a surreal experience for the person that's going through it, and of course the people that it affects around them. And it does bring up so much fear. But often we feel when our body isn't doing what we want it to do, or if someone else's body isn't doing what we want it to do, it often brings up our inability to control something as well, is also where we struggle. It's in those moments we realize how we can't control life as much as we had led ourselves to believe or would like to think we could. So therefore it does bring on new awarenesses. It does challenge old mindsets. So it is a spiritual awakening for the person that's going through the illness, but often for the people that are going through it with them.
I 100% agree with that. Because again, I refer back to my brother Kurt, and when he got ill, and leading up to the diagnosis, there was fear around thinking that he might be ill. And then when he was diagnosed, it was a very scary time for me. He was, one of my main support people. But by the time Curtis passed away, he grew so much. And for me to be able to witness that, to actually be a part of it and see that growth, I would say he became my hero in many ways, because I felt like he walked through the illness with dignity, and I don't think I would have been able to walk through the illness with the dignity that he did. But he also walked through it with humor. And I watched him, the common saying that I say is, in the 3.5 years that he wasn't well, that it felt like I watched him go through 3 lifetimes. He changed that much. And I don't want to say changed, he grew that much is a better way of saying it.
Evolved.
And it was a real beautiful experience to watch. At the same time, it was extremely painful to be saying goodbye to somebody who was my main support person and a really good friend.
And I feel this is where, when it comes to those real life events that are very real, very emotional, very hard, I feel there's a time and a place for spirituality, and it's often not then. Yes. And what I mean by that is, when you're going through a very human event, You don't want to hear spiritual understanding that this was all meant to happen, and because actually what you need in that moment in time is to be very human and to be with all of your emotions and to I guess, savor the experience with that person. And of course, illnesses in general are so different because some are life-threatening, some are over many, many years, many decades. It's vast, as we both know. But at the same time, it doesn't take away from the emotional turbulence that it still brings on to a person, their family, their friends, their communities. And the last thing anyone wants to hear is a spiritual understanding of how this is amazing or how you're going to grow from it. Because it definitely does not feel like that in the moment.
I think I can safely agree with that. And I can be guilty because I've had so many of those moments now that when someone else is going through it, I know it's going to be great for them. And I have found it's a balancing act of when to throw that in and when not to, because they're in the height of all those emotions.
Because you can actually create a spiritual awakening for a person, not because you're trying to explain to them why this is good for them, but it's actually by holding that safe place for them to be with their emotions, for them to have that realization for themselves.
I would agree.
Which again, I don't think that happens often, because often if we see someone we love or family members going through difficult times, we don't often know how to help or what to do. And so therefore we just often start talking, which isn't always the solution. It's more about maybe actually just sit and be with them in the moment. And I have always found that to be more healing, more understanding, and to create more awareness for everyone involved. I think the silence in those moments says a lot more about life than just talking for the sake of
filling the space. But don't you think that a lot of people fill the space because they're uncomfortable with the emotion the other person is going through?
No, definitely.
The next question that I really want to talk to you about is, if you happen to be someone that is really religious, would you say that that spiritual awakening would be defined differently? If someone who's really religious and they have a reset moment, would they experience that differently than we have?
I think it depends, because we both come from religious backgrounds as well. It's not that we started off at zero in our understanding. And I feel obviously, as you know, when you're working with people, your language that you use is vital in actually being able to communicate that certain experiences are able to be processed. So again, because the truth doesn't change, but obviously the way in which you can interpret that truth can change quite a lot. I've always thought of, when you're doing this kind of work of assisting other people, you have to be quite bilingual in the sense of how you actually are able to communicate to a person, which takes a long time to develop that skill.
I think it is a matter of language. So, because if I think about the first time that, I'm sure it wasn't the first reset that I had, but that first time I was aware of it when I was a teenager, that felt very religious and spiritual as I knew in that moment. Like, I've been raised in that religion, and it felt very real. And I can tell you, for years after that, anytime anything started to happen to me, I would say, "Oh, don't worry, have a hotline to heaven. I'm good. I have a hotline to heaven. I'm good." Fool's gold, I'd say, but that was the language I was using at that time. Did I use that same language with the consequent other ones? No. So, but I do think it is a matter of, if you're assisting someone that is in the middle of a reset or, the spiritual awakening, it is about the language.
You can often relate to someone in the sense of where you were in your path when you had a similar experience, even if that was a decade ago, to what you see, what's happening in front of you now. And there is always going to be a mixture of the different languages actually used or required, because even in the sense of when I had what you would call a spiritual awakening with Michael, it was Archangel Michael or talking to an angel, but I was never religious enough to actually refer to angels or archangels or anything like that. So how even my language has evolved, I just refer to him as Michael. I don't actually refer to him as archangel or saint or nothing like that. Whereas for someone else who is coming from a religious background and their entire lives have called him Saint Michael, Archangel Michael, Angel Michael, I'll use that terminology just because it's what gives them the most comfort in that particular time.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
But again, you and I both know our evolution of maybe how we reference things now today is very different than a decade ago. But you still have to use a lot of that language day to day, depending on who you're talking to.
So then let me ask you this. A lot of the things that I have read in the past about spiritual awakenings, and my expectation in the early days was, I'm going to go through these stages, because you often read there's like 5 stages of spiritual awakening. And I often refer to myself as the child on the slow bus because I haven't hit all 5 of those stages yet. So I'd be interested to hear what you think about some of the languaging out there that you're going to go through these stages of spiritual awakening.
Because I do honestly believe that the process is so different for every person. I don't feel there's an official rule book of how to have a spiritual awakening, because anything I've read also, it's never been my experience. And I do feel, as we've been talking about, depending on the spiritual awakening or experience that you're having, even in your own life, they can be so vastly different as well. So often if we start conditioning them to what they should be, then that's the best guaranteed way of how not to have them. Or even if you do have them, you can easily miss them because you would quickly think, well, that wasn't one. I just, as you said earlier,
it's a nervous breakdown.
But so I do think, like many things in life, the more we condition them, the less likely they are to.
Or like I said to you just recently, gee, I don't know what's wrong. I've lost all motivation. So anyone who knows me would go, okay, what's going on there? Because I've always been so driven. And maybe I actually haven't lost motivation at all. Like you said to me, maybe I'm just at a place where I'm okay to sit with me.
Which was
very unusual. And again, a reset, if for lack of a better way of saying it, because I wouldn't have sat still for 5 minutes. I mean, maybe I would have if you paid me, but it would have been painful. So to be able to sit, to be with myself, to not feel like I must be filling every single day is something completely different than I had in the past.
Again, when you said that to me, I was incredibly excited for you, because it just meant what was driving you before to be motivated had evolved quite a bit. It doesn't mean that you're never going to be motivated again, or that you don't care, or that you're depressed. Quite the opposite. It's actually, no, you trust in life that a little bit more. You're more at peace. You know what's for you, won't go past you. It's a very different way to live.
And again, as we started off, when you mentioned the idea of what we thought a spiritual awakening was to come to a place of peace. And in a sense, I can say I have achieved a level of peace. Does that mean I'm at peace 24/7? No. It just depends on what's showing up in that moment.
I think it's the exploration of the mind, body, emotions, and soul in equal parts over the course of many, many years. And I feel by actually doing that, and by not conditioning what they should look like, and beginning to navigate and morph your own versions of those, that you can get to a place of feeling more at peace than ever before. The exploration of the traumas that even happened from the past can lead to so many spiritual awakenings within the present.
And I think that's what excites me about us doing this, because from the time that I made a little vow to myself and to Grace that I wanted to be a light, that I really wanted to be a light in the world to help other people grow and evolve. And I had no idea what that would look like. I certainly didn't know that it meant that I had to go on a journey of becoming at peace with all my traumas. But then when I started to understand that mind, body, and emotion connection and started to really go back and experience that, I can say that I am grateful. I'd say probably 90% of my traumas. And there's some days I'm grateful for all of them. But then there are days when the emotion comes up that is very reminiscent of another time in my life that I go, no, really? No, I don't want to do this today. And so then it's that exploration again. It's part of that journey that we've talked about. And that for me is why I like that word, the journey, because we're all on a journey. There isn't a place we're going to get to, that it's continually unfolding. But having been through quite a bit and traveled this journey, I would have never thought I'd say those words to you, that I'm grateful for the traumas in my life.
Because it takes a long time to get there, more often than not. But as we both know, no one can do that journey for you because it's yours. And regardless of whether any person believes whether they chose for it to happen or not, it doesn't change the fact that your past exists and that there are areas of exploration that can always help and assist us to get a better understanding to what those experiences mean for us and to us in the present and maybe even for the future. But it's very difficult to get any of those understandings if we don't actually take the time to sit with them and to begin to understand.
And so, having said that, that's what I would call a spiritual awakening, is taking the time to understand what that represented to you and explore the emotions of it and being to be at peace with the emotions of it so that you can understand how important it was for you today, even though it happened way back then. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.